Greetings, and thank you for being part of this important gathering. I'm Lisa Eisen, co-president of Schusterman Family Philanthropies, where I lead our U.S. Jewish and gender and reproductive equity portfolios. I helped launch the SRE network in March 2018 to ensure our Jewish workplaces and communal spaces will be safe, respectful, and equitable for all. I serve as advisory board chair of SRE, and I'm very proud of what we've accomplished to date. Over the last 24 hours, we've heard from people who work and live in the Jewish community. We've heard their stories, their bravery, and their commitment to creating safer, healthier Jewish organizations and communities. We've made notes, actual and mental, about ideas to follow up on and connections to make. There is so much we can learn from each other and so much we can do to strengthen our sector. Our next few speakers will address the important topic of courage. We'll start by zooming out and considering what we can learn from research and learning in the broader field. In just a moment, we'll meet a trailblazer, Dr. Jennifer Fryde. Dr. Fryde is the founder and president of the Center for Institutional Courage. She coined the terms institutional courage and institutional betrayal, which she will explain to us. Following her keynote presentation and a quick break with Josh Feldman, the founder of R&R, The Rest of Our Lives, we will hear stories of courage from three amazing leaders in our community, Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, Rabbi Mary Zamor, and Nancy Torres. First, we will ground ourselves in the research and ideas of Dr. Fryde. How might we understand institutional courage and betrayal in our own communities? How may institutional courage be a part of the tshuva process? It is now my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jennifer Fryde.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here today and to share with you some of my work and thoughts, and I hope you find it helpful. If I could have the first slide, please. I'll be talking about research I've done over really many decades with a focus on some of my newer work on institutional courage. The talk will be in 5 short chapters. First, I'll talk about some older work on betrayal trauma and betrayal blindness. Then I'll discuss work on institutional betrayal, some lessons we've learned from studies we've run on college campuses, the topic of responses to disclosures of difficult material and one particular kind of problematic response I call DARVO, and then finally, the last chapter will be on institutional courage. Consider the case of Frank Fitzpatrick. This is from 1992 in the New York Times article, and it included these comments. Frank Fitzpatrick began remembering having been sexually molested by a parish priest at age 12. Mr. Fitzpatrick's retrieval of the repressed memories began, he said, when I was feeling a great mental pain. Mr. Fitzpatrick slowly realized that the mental pain was due to a betrayal of some kind and remembered the sound of heavy breathing. Then I realized I'd been sexually abused by someone I loved, said Mr. Fitzpatrick. But it was not until 2 weeks later that he suddenly remembered the priest, the Reverend James R. Porter. That case received a lot of attention in the press, and it eventually resulted in a criminal prosecution against James Porter, which is unusual for events that happened so far in the past. But the evidence of the abuse was overwhelming. Dozens and dozens of victims came forward, and Porter himself was taped admitting to the abuse. But it really raised a puzzle for me. At the time, I was a professor of psychology with a focus on memory, and I had not received information in my own education or field to explain why would individuals remain unaware of or even forget traumas they'd experienced. I understood we have memory because it's functional to have memory. Why would we forget something important? And related to that, why are some traumas more likely to be unseen and forgotten? And to answer this question, I came up with what I call betrayal trauma theory. The basic idea of betrayal trauma theory takes 2 core aspects of human beings and holds them together. The first aspect is our exquisite sensitivity to betrayal. We have the ability to evaluate the trustworthiness of other people because it's important to our survival. We interact with people over and over, and if they betray us, if they cheat us, it is bad for us. So it's good to be aware of it and then to take action. And in fact, we are usually exquisitely sensitive to that kind of cheating and betrayal, and then we do take action. In fact, when we're empowered, our two most common responses are to confront or withdraw. So we say, don't ever do that to me again. Or we say, I'm done, I'm out of this relationship. That's what we do when we're empowered, and it's kind of like fight and flight. At the same time, something else that is even arguably more fundamental about us is that we have many periods in life, particularly in infancy and childhood, but throughout the lifespan, when we are dependent on other people. And the nature of dependence is an asymmetric relationship where one person is giving resources to the dependent person. So parents give enormous resources to infants and children. This needs to be reinforcing to the parents or they won't do it. It's just too hard. And evolution has given us a reinforcement system. It's called the attachment system. Caregivers get rewarded by the attention of the receiver of that caregiving. If you think about it, a baby has a job, and that job is to be lovable. And the best way to be lovable is to love in return. This encourages behaviors of approach and positive engagement. With varying degrees, dependence and attachment continue throughout the life, including in family, school, workplace, community, and our nation. Betrayal trauma theory comes in when these two systems are in conflict with each other. Because what does a dependent person do when they're betrayed? The very person they need to go to for help is the source of harm. And this creates a very difficult bind. They need the relationship. So those normal responses, those empowered responses of confrontation or withdrawal are going to be a problem. They're going to push away the very person they need. A way out of this bind is what I call betrayal blindness. And this is not seeing the betrayal that you're experiencing, or maybe somebody very close to you is experiencing. It's an ability to not see something. And it's a very adaptive ability in some situations where that relationship needs to be preserved, because without the relationship, one can't survive. So betrayal blindness creates a short-run survival, but a long-run cost. And you might think about in your own life times when you've been dependent on another person or a system where you just couldn't afford to rock the boat, where you just needed to keep that dependent relationship going. Betrayal trauma theory suggests that there are two primary dimensions of traumatic events. One dimension that historically was the focus was what you might call life threat. It's the terrorizing aspect of traumatic events. But the other dimension is this social betrayal, and it can happen not only during an event, but before and after an event. So these two dimensions are independent of each other, but certain events will have high levels of one or the other. So a sadistic abuse by someone you love, it is both highly terrorizing and social betrayal. The Holocaust is an example of an event that's highly traumatizing, highly terrorizing, and involves enormous social betrayal. But events can be high in one of these dimensions and low in the other. And betrayal trauma theory says if you have more betrayal, you're more likely to forget or be unaware of traumas. 20 years of research in my laboratory has supported this premise. Not only that, we found that betrayal is very toxic to people. If we compare events that are similar, traumas that are similar, but they vary in how much betrayal is involved, we see that traumatic betrayals produce more symptoms of all sorts of things. Forgetting, yes, but also depression, anxiety, shame, PTSD, dissociation, physical illness, hallucination, self-harm, problematic substance use, and even re-victimization. Not only that, we find that there's a gender effect in that girls and women are more likely to be victims of betrayal trauma than boys or men. And I should add, boys and men are just as likely to be traumatized. It's that the traumas they experience tend to be lower in betrayals. So they're more likely to be attacked by somebody they're not close to. A girl or a woman is more likely to be attacked by somebody they are close to. Institutional betrayal is a newer line of research that my students and I have picked up, but it grows right out of this theory that I was just telling you about. The question we asked was, can institutions be perpetrators of betrayal, not just individual people? And we thought this might be the case because we depend on trust and love institutions. In fact, our attachment systems work with institutions. And this raises the question then, can they betray us? And if so, is it harmful? And if the institutions were dependent on betrayals, can we show betrayal blindness for that very betrayal? In order to do research on this, we defined institutional betrayal as any situation where institutions harm those dependent on the institution. But importantly, this includes the failure to prevent or respond supportively to wrongdoings within the institution when there's a reasonable expectation of protection. In fact, most of our core institutions do give us some expectation of protection, whether it's the government or our churches or our schools. We believe that the institution has our back, that they're caring about our best interests, and if something bad happens, they're there to help us. In our first published study, Carly Smith and I investigated institutional betrayal in the context of educational institutions. We had a sample of undergraduate women, and we measured their sexual assault experiences, their trauma symptoms, and their exposure to institutional betrayal. Well, there are lots of measures of sexual assault and lots of measures of trauma symptoms, but we had to come up with a new measure of institutional betrayal. Our measure is very simple and has been used now in many studies and can be adapted to lots of different contexts. If somebody said that they've been sexually assaulted in the context of the institution, they were then asked a series of simple yes-no questions. Was the institution involved in some way, for instance, by not taking proactive steps to prevent this type of experience, all the way to responses afterwards, such as covering up the experience, punishing you in some way for the experience? What we found was that 46% of our female students with unwanted sexual experiences also reported experiencing institutional betrayal. That number surprised me. I thought it was going to be lower. I thought we'd have some, but not a whopping 46% of individuals. Furthermore, we found that the institutional betrayal exacerbates the trauma symptoms. So here we have a graph, and on the bottom we have sexual assault as a continuous variable. That is, there's an amount of sexual assault that gets measured, and some people have none, some people have a little bit, and some people have a lot of experiences of sexual assault. And going up, we have a symptom, in this case, anxiety. And like other researchers, we find that more sexual assault is associated with more anxiety. But what's new and important is that if you add institutional betrayal, that relationship is exacerbated. That is, the institutional betrayal adds harm to the individuals who've been assaulted. And it's not just physical problems. We find a similar relationship, not just mental problems, we find a similar relationship with physical health costs. That is, the more institutional betrayal, even holding constant the interpersonal betrayal, we see more physical problems that are common symptoms of traumatic exposure, such as difficulty sleeping and pain and headaches and so forth. Some other researchers, using our measure, looked at military sexual trauma survivors who had experienced institutional betrayal and compared them to military sexual trauma survivors who had not experienced institutional betrayal. They found that those survivors with institutional betrayal were more likely to have PTSD symptoms, more likely to have depression, and alarmingly higher odds of attempting suicide. In other words, institutional betrayal can be a life and death matter for people. We also have evidence there is institutional betrayal blindness. For instance, when people stay in the institution where they've been betrayed, they're more likely to have symptoms of forgetting and unawareness, even when controlling for betrayal trauma exposure. Institutional betrayal is not just about sexual violence. It's about all sorts of kinds of betrayal that can occur, from racism and homophobia, and it can occur in all sorts of kinds of institutions, not just schools. We've even found there's a kind of institutional betrayal around the management of COVID. In one study, we looked at undergraduates who had to be in a university during the first year of the COVID epidemic, and we found that half of them, more than half of them, had experienced institutional betrayal in how COVID was being handled. For instance, they were punished when they reported safety infractions. And this institutional betrayal was associated with their trauma symptoms, again, even when controlling for all sorts of other variables, including whether they'd had COVID or somebody close to them had had COVID. Institutional betrayal is not just bad for people, it actually is bad for the institutions too. It often lets people get through a short-term situation, but then down the road has all these costs. It leads people to leave the institution, or if they stay, to disengage. It leads to illness and absenteeism, to loss of potential talent and membership, and also to internal rot, corruption, and eventual collapse. Sometimes there's a terrible reputational cost. This depends on the societal context around the institution as to whether there will be a reputational cost. I want to just come back to this idea of our attachment system and talk about why we're so vulnerable to institutional betrayal. And I think it's a very human thing. The reason I have a picture of a snake here is to remind me of an analogy. So this is a boa constrictor. I happen to love boa constrictors. I think they're very beautiful and that they make very good pets. And the reason I think they make very good pets is that they coil around me. Nice big boa will coil around me. I'm not afraid. I know I'm way too big to be eaten. And it feels good to be hugged. It's essentially a hug, but from the snake's perspective, it is not a hug at all. I'm just a warm tree. Snakes don't have attachment systems, but I do. I'm a mammal. I have an attachment system. So when that snake hugs me, I feel the emotions of love. Love for the snake. I feel kind of loved by the snake, even though intellectually I know I'm not. The analogy here is to institutions. We can love institutions, but institutions cannot love us back. People inside institutions can love us back, but institutions don't have a central nervous system. They don't have an attachment system. They can't love us back. But because we can love them, we're vulnerable to betrayal. And it hurts us when we're betrayed. But this is not something bad about us. It's not bad that we love institutions. It's very, very human. It also speaks to the distinction one might make between two ways institutional betrayal harms us. One is pragmatic, and one is the psychological betrayal. The pragmatic harm comes from the institution failing to fix problems that are pragmatically harmful. So a government that lets people drink water with lead is obviously harming people pragmatically. But a government that separates children from their parents at the border can harm people that care about their country, even if they're not involved with direct implications of that separation. Okay, briefly, I just want to tell you something we learned from some of our campus studies that I think as a lesson for many different contexts. So at the University of Oregon, where I was a professor until very recently, I recently retired, there was a crisis on campus in 2014. There was an allegation that came to light that there was a gang rape involving members of the basketball team in which a student athlete was the victim of this gang rape. But it took 2 months before this came to light. And the allegation was the rape occurred in early March and it came to light in May. In the meantime, that basketball team, including these players, had gone off to the NCAA championship. And when it came to light, it seemed to many people that the university had chosen their athletic team and their reputation over the safety of students on campus. And so there were protests. During that summer, my students and I decided that it was really important to collect data on the rates of college campus sexual assault on our particular campus, because it was very obvious the university was going to have to respond to this crisis and that data would guide that response. So we did a survey, And I can add that the administration wasn't very happy with us at first when we did this, but eventually came around. We did a survey where we measured the amount of assault, and we repeated that survey, this time with the support of the university, in the spring, so the spring of 2015. We had a random selection of undergraduates and graduate students, and we measured their exposure to sexual violence and institutional betrayal. And what we found was, looking at 6 different kinds of victimization, we found that in every case, when we looked at undergraduate students, that there was victimization going on, and the rates were alarmingly high for our female students, but also in some cases for our male students as well. Every time you see some asterisk there in the numbers in bold, it's because women are experiencing more of this kinds of victimization. When we looked at our graduate students, we also saw that female students were at higher rates of victimization compared to our male students. But you may notice the pattern looks a little bit different between our graduate students and our undergraduate students, and that's what I want to draw your attention to. This slide compares undergraduate to graduate students for female students. And what these asterisks now refer to is which group of students experience more of the victimization. And you can see that generally undergraduates experience more victimization than graduate students, with one exception, where graduate students experience statistically significantly more victimization. And I believe what this tells us a story about both the opportunity for abuse and the role of power. Undergraduates live with other undergraduates, and that's where they primarily are getting exposed to sexual violence. Graduate students, in contrast, don't tend to live with other students, but they work very closely with faculty on whom they are very dependent. And it is faculty perpetrators of sexual harassment that is greater for graduate students than for undergraduates. Furthermore, that faculty and staff perpetration is associated with all sorts of challenges these students are then having: feeling unsafe, trauma symptoms, experiences of additional institutional betrayal. We can even argue that sexual harassment by faculty and staff is a kind of overt institutional betrayal. It's not just about failing to prevent a response, but it's about actually overtly engaging in institutional betrayal, because faculty and staff represent the institution to the students. Okay, I want to now tell you a little bit about response to disclosure and DARVO. One of the things at the heart of trauma psychology is the nature of response to disclosure, because people are very afraid to talk about what happened to them. But if they don't talk about it, it's very hard for them to get help. Not reporting sexual violence and harassment is currently the norm, however. For instance, only 6% of our sexually harassed graduate students reported the harassment to university sources. 94% didn't. Why is this? I would submit to you, people don't report because reporting is truly risky. Reporting can lead to a positive outcome, but it can just as likely, sometimes more likely, lead to a negative outcome. And that's because the outcome depends on the social and institutional response. The impact of social response to disclosure is so great that it can account for more about how somebody is doing after they're raped than details of the rape itself. This is research from Ullman and her colleagues. And they have found that negative social reactions include blaming, not believing, treating you differently, distraction, egocentric behavior, and particularly damaging, controlling the survivor's decision. For instance, telling other people about their experience without their permission. My students and I have studied disclosure quite a lot and done research, and I don't have time to tell you about it, but I do want to tell you that we have a listening skill tip sheet that's available to the public on my website, and you can get it by Googling Good Listener and my name. There's a particularly pernicious response we've studied. I call it DARVO, and that's an acronym, and it's one that I first published in the 90s, but have been doing research on pretty extensively since then. And it's an acronym that stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse, Victim, and Offender. Deny is what the perpetrator might say when somebody tries to hold them accountable. It never happened. Attack is to attack the credibility of the person making the accusation. You're a liar. And reversing victim and offender is just what it says. It's the perpetrator taking the victim role, saying, I'm the real victim here. Darvo seems to work. We've seen it on the national stage where the person who gets Darvoed is not believed over the person who does the Darvoing. In studies that Sarah Harsey and I have conducted with our colleague Eileen Zurbruggen, we've found that Darvo does hang together. If somebody is likely to attack credibility or deny what they've been accused of, they're also more likely to take the victim role. It's also gendered in that women are more likely to be Darvoed. And Darvo by the perpetrator is associated with victim self-blame. That is, when somebody gets Darvoed, they tend to blame themselves. We've also found that students who experience sexual assault and then have to stay and encounter their perpetrator experience Darvo tactics from their perpetrator, and they consider it harmful. And in new research, we've found that the people who use Darvo are more likely to believe in rape myths, hostile sexism, and are more likely to perpetrate sexual harassment. So Darvo probably plays a role in perpetuating sexual violence. For third parties, Darvo results in more doubt about the victim's credibility. So if you hear somebody use Darvo and you don't know this is a tactic, you may believe that the victim is lying because you hear the person accused claiming that. The good news is we found that education about Darvo reduces its power to discredit the victim's credibility, suggesting that Darvo must be recognized and identified in order to defang it. There is institutional Darvo. That's when the institution uses Darvo to deflect accountability. And of course, it's a form of institutional betrayal. One day in late 2019, I woke up to a lot of emails saying, hey, your concept Darvo was on South Park. That doesn't usually happen to a psychology professor, so it was an unusual experience. If you're curious, you can Google Darvo South Park and you'll find quite a humorous clip about Darvo. Okay, finally, institutional courage. So I've told you about a lot of bad things, betrayal, trauma, institutional betrayal, and Darvo, but there is hope, and I really believe that. I began with the question, can we repair and prevent institutional betrayal and institutional Darvo? And my answer is yes, we can, and it's through institutional courage. Currently, I'm defining institutional courage as an institution's commitment to seek the truth and engage in moral action, despite unpleasantness, risk, and short-term cost. It's a pledge to protect and care for those who depend on the institution. It's a compass oriented to the common good of individuals, institutions, and the world. And it's a force that transforms institutions into more accountable, equitable, and healthy places for everyone. I have suggested 11 steps to promote institutional courage. This is not exhaustive. There's more institutions can do besides this, but this is a good starting place. Number one, comply with civil rights laws, because we do have a lot of good laws in our country to protect people's civil rights, and they're not always complied with. But don't stop there. Go beyond mere compliance. Go to the spirit of the law. And beware risk management. A lot of institutional betrayal occurs when institutions get overly focused on avoiding litigation. Two, educate the institutional community, especially the leadership, about all these issues. Teach people about how victims respond. Teach people about institutional betrayal so that they don't commit institutional betrayal out of ignorance. Number three, whenever possible, add checks and balances to the power structure. diffuse highly dependent relationships. Sometimes this means having more than one person in the room with a dependent other. Sometimes this means creating an ombuds office where people can go and safely discuss problems they're having. 4, respond well to victim disclosures and create a trauma-informed reporting policy. 5, bear witness, be accountable, apologize. Apologies, sincere apologies, can go so far. 6, maybe this is my favorite, cherish the whistleblowers, cherish the truth tellers. We tend to demonize people who come forward and tell us when something's wrong, but they are the best friends of an institution. And to cherish these individuals, it's not enough to try to stop retaliation. It's necessary to be proactive, to acknowledge what they've done, to publicly thank them, if they're open to that, for their bravery. 7, conduct scientifically sound anonymous surveys. So like that study I told you about on campus, that can be done in any institutional context. There are good measurement instruments out there to find out what people are really experiencing. And they won't tell you necessarily without this being anonymous and scientifically sound. 8, regularly engage in self-study. So big institutions should form committees to regularly question whether institutional betrayal is occurring and then do something about it if it is. 9, be transparent about data and policy. Sexual violence, corruption, institutional betrayal, they all thrive in secrecy. Transparency is a very good way to stop these problems. 10, use the organization to address the societal problem. So, for instance, if you're a religious organization, devote some of your resources not just to fixing problems within your own backyard, but to addressing the problem on a societal level. And then finally, commit to ongoing resources to these various steps. We have been conducting research on institutional courage, and our findings are very encouraging. We created a new measurement instrument. We have done several studies, one with 800 employees around the country, and our results show that institutional courage buffers against sexual violence and institutional betrayal for employees, and it's really good for the institutions as well. We have similar results with a study involving undergraduate students. I want to tell you about one example of institutional courage. It's easy to come up with examples of institutional betrayal. It's not quite as easy to come up with examples of institutional courage, but they're out there, and here's one of them. It started with a bad situation. In 1998, Brenda Tracy reported to the police that she'd been gang raped at a party, and 2 of the accused assailants were Oregon State University football players. Prosecutors led her to believe the case was weaker than it was, her rape kits were destroyed, and the 2 football players had 1 game suspension and community service. No one from the university talked to Brenda Tracy. This was a highly traumatizing event. She was raped, and then all the institutions turned against her. For 16 years, she suffered in silence about what happened to her. But then in 2014, suddenly this country was talking about campus sexual assault. And Brenda saw all that talk, and it was on the cover of many magazines. And she got up the nerve to call the university and say, what had happened to me? She asked the university what had happened to her case. At first, the university was not eager to respond, but she had the opportunity to tell a newspaper columnist about what happened, and he wrote a column about her case. And here's where things really took a turn that was different. The president of the university, the then president, Ed Ray, read the column and ordered an investigation. So rather than putting his energy into circling the wagons and getting crisis response teams, he investigated. And 3 weeks later, he met with Brenda Tracy and shared the results of the investigation. He apologized. He wrote her a letter on university letterhead. He said, "Dear Brenda, Oregon State officials are very grateful that you took the time to meet with us. We are so sorry for what you experienced in 1998 and have lived with since. We have learned recently of your suffering, and it's heartbreaking, and your bravery inspires us. We are also grateful to you for raising the public dialogue about the consequences of sexual violence in our society and for raising a discussion of how society can better assist survivors of such violence. While we cannot undo this nightmare, we apologize to you for any failure on Oregon State University's part to better assist you in 1998. So that second sentence is the apology sentence. And I'm sure lawyers were all over it, and I probably had some say in the exact wording. But I know Ed Ray also made sure that his sincerity came through, and Brenda Tracy did experience this as a sincere apology. In other words, the needle can be thread here. Apologies are possible. Ed Ray went on. As promised a few weeks ago, we conducted an exhaustive review of the facts of how OSU handled this matter 16 years ago. The review was completed this past Friday, and we want to share the results of that review with you. He didn't stop there. Ed Ray not only apologized to Brenda Tracy, but he then hired her to be a consultant to address him to improve institutional response. And this led to many important innovations and changes at the university. So what does institutional courage look like? Well, think about all the things here. It involved investigation and transparency. It involved acknowledging and apologizing. It deeply involved cherishing the whistleblower by creating a partnership, by hiring her, which is to communicate, we appreciate you. You did something good, and we want to work with you. It led to increased resources and awareness on campus, but they also reached beyond. They went to the state legislature, and they lobbied for new legislation, and some of that occurred. This led to many changes that were good at the university. So, to summarize, institutional courage is possible. It's clearly needed. It works, but it's still relatively rare. And I believe we need a lot more research because, like with any problem, we need to understand the basic mechanisms and causes in order to really fix the problem. So what to do about all that? I left my university position and founded a nonprofit I call the Center for Institutional Courage. And our mission is to create the research and education needed for leading to institutional courage in our society. And I hope you visit our website. Thank you so much for your attention. And I've really been honored to speak with you today.